2000 was the first time in American history when children would not expect to be richer than and live longer than their parents. Yeah. It's sort of shocking. So you say to yourself, what happened in the 90s and in the 2000s to change that? Yeah. And in my judgment, biggest single one was NAFTA, the Uruguay round, or giving China most favored nation treatment, all of which were done in a very short period of time. And they wanted this uber free trade. And the result was some people got very wealthy, but the vast majority of people got some cheap stuff, but basically lost their jobs and lost their communities and ultimately their families and in a lot of cases their lives.
Welcome to Daring Greatly.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, Bob, for a few reasons. One, you're obviously a person who I've looked and followed over the years with great respect and admiration. The second is that this is a show about statesmanship, and nearly every guest that we've come on, had on thus far is either an academic or a biographer, and you're actually the first person who has both advised the President of the United States, but also been a statesman in your own right. So I look forward to diving into some of the fundamentals and also your own life story. Of course, you served on the Senate Finance Committee for Bob Dole.
That's correct. Yeah, I was the chief of staff of the Finance Committee. What he was chairman. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And actually, my first political event in my life was in 1996. I was 6 years old, and my mom took me to hear Bob Dole in Jackson, Michigan, at Cascades Park. So
yeah, he was a great man. We miss him. He's been gone a couple of years now. Yeah. And he was a good close friend, and he probably was a statesman, right? So, he was a close friend. I saw him the day before he died. He's just a great man.
Yeah, legendary figure. And then, of course, you were the deputy USTR to Ronald Reagan, and then the trade representative for President Donald Trump most recently. So I want to begin with a question. One of the lines that you actually quoted to the Chinese, which you had in your book, was from Confucius. And it says, "In the past, when I evaluated a person, I believed what they said. Now when I evaluate a person, I listen to them and see what they do." It's a great line. And obviously you're quoting this to them. You're assessing them across from the table. You hear what their words are, but you want to see what their actions are going to be. I'm curious if you were to flip the table around and they were looking at you and they're negotiating with Ambassador Lighthizer and they're looking at your track record from Dole to Reagan to Trump. What is that through line in terms of action that they see in your career? What do you think they would say, this is what's really driving Bob Lighthizer?
Well, let me say, first of all, I use that quote in my prepared remarks when we began the negotiations. Sitting in the OEOB in what was the conference room of the Secretary of State in the old days originally. In the 19th century. So it was a grand spot. And I thought it was perfect because my position was sort of Reagan's position of trust but verify, right? In other words, that this is not going to be agreement where we just have words. This is going to be agreement where it's written like, well, yeah, right things, and there's follow through because the Chinese have a long history of not following through on their agreements. In terms of what they would have seen had it been flipped around with me, I think they had studied me plenty, right? And they knew that there was a kind of a consistency. My basic views on policy and the morality of government hadn't changed a bit since I was a young man. I obviously learned from some of the best, and I was always stubborn enough not to be influenced by things that were going to happen. I started with probably a contrarian personality on the theory that if everyone agrees with something, it probably is worth taking a look, seeing whether it's accurate or not. But it's funny when the way you phrase it. They kind of had the view that I was one of the people that was responsible for the disagreements or the negotiations between the United States and Japan. So on numerous occasions early on, they would say, "We are not Japan." And the first time they said it, and 2 or 3 people said it, at first time I said, I think, well, what exactly does that mean?
Yeah.
What are they talking about, and then I sort of deciphered that what they really meant was that Japan was on a roll, Japan was doing great, the United States in the 80s in the Reagan administration basically got in disagreements with them, took them on. A lot of the things we did were pro-American, and then you saw the Plaza Accord, and then you saw the debt bubble or the currency bubble, whatever it was, and then you saw Japan sort of flatline and GDP in nominal terms. So they kind of went like this, and the United States was like this. So they're catching up fast, and then we go to a point where they mainline. So I think they're basically saying, you can't do to us what you did to Japan. Of course, my own sense is I didn't really do anything to Japan other than represent U.S. interests. But my guess is they would have looked at me and said, here's someone who's sort of a consistent pro-America guy. He's not going to be influenced by things. I hope that's what they thought.
Yeah, I'm sure. So before we get into the dealings with China and kind of more recent events, take me back to Ashtabula, Ohio. Ashtabula.
Yeah. So, Ashtabula was it's one of thousands and thousands of places across America. These were the places that made America great, right? It was a town that had a lot of small manufacturing. It had ore would come in from Minnesota along the Great Lakes, come in there, and then be trained down to Pittsburgh to be made into steel. So it had a part of the whole industrialization of America. Port manufacturing, did auto parts. And it was a thriving city. And then, by 1970, it had been at the top, and then it started coming back down. And a lot of the kind of mainstream people would say, well, the workers didn't work hard enough, or the management wasn't smart enough, or the unions were bad, or something. Yeah. People would have a whole variety of these explanations for what happened to these people, my people, right? And the reality is that the biggest single explanation was that we had a bad trade policy.
Yeah.
The government got stirred up in this notion that cheap stuff and free trade was more important than the welfare of these people.
Yeah.
And that they would, in the opinion of an economist here or there, they should all move to Mississippi and do something. And of course, there's no reality in any of this. And so it was, in my opinion, misdirected policy that hurt this. And you could sort of see it come down. And now I have in the book, if you look at Ashtabula, it's, I don't know, the college education level is 15% or 17%. The poverty level is probably 30% of the people are below poverty. These are all good people.
Yeah.
They didn't do anything wrong. They just literally got into a position where we had a government policy that was harmful to them.
Yeah. And if you look at even the opioid epidemic and deaths of despair, I mean, especially if you look at a graph, it's shocking. I mean, it's one of these things where now there's over 100,000 people a year in America that die of really overdoses. And if you go back to 1990, this was like 20,000 a year. And then at some point, actually in the maybe 2014, 2015, it just skyrockets, Yeah. And you would think that our leaders, and some of them like you have, raised this, but would look at that graph and say, what the hell is going on? Right?
But you take a step back. Let's take a step back. First of all, we had an epidemic of crack cocaine that was very damaging to minority communities, right? Very damaging. And there was kind of a, we don't know, and and nobody focused on it.
Yeah.
Then you had this explosion of fentanyl. Which was now affecting white working class families as well as these minority families. So and all of a sudden people are looking at it. And the work of, you mentioned Deaths of Despair of Angus Deaton and his wife and Case, their work was just seminal work in this area. To kind of put a data point on what you just said, right now, these high school educated people in my hometown are living 7 years less on average than a college educated person. I mean, it's sort of staggering when you think about it. And what is it? It's opioids, it's suicide, first of all,
Yeah.
opioids and alcohol. And, this is another example of bad policy. First of all, there's a level of despair that comes from economic policy. And then secondly, there is this, I would say, predatory action by the Chinese government, which is basically selling all these opioids, these synthetic opioids, all this fentanyl to gangs in Mexico and bringing it to the United States. So when I see it, I see a failure of the American people on economic policy, and I see proof positive of the predatory nature and of the adversarial nature between the United States and China. So those are. And I talk to people about, do you think China's an adversary? Do you think they're a partner? And if you get someone who's in this category of, well, I think we can work together and blah, blah, blah. And I bring up the fentanyl. I said, now, how do you explain that? And usually they just sort of sidestep it, right? But it's proof positive that this is a very aggressive predatory act, right?
And payback for the opium wars. I mean,
it's, well, I don't know if it's precisely for that reason or just because it's part of their overall strategy, right, of trying to bring down the United States and become number one in the world. So, and you went back in time, if you went back in time to like 1990, the difference in life expectancy, I believe I'm accurately reflecting their book, Deaths of Despair, was probably, instead of 7 years, it was probably a year or two.
Yeah.
I mean, literally that whole thing happened in that very short period of time, and it's shocking.
Yeah. And it's hard to even, I think back to my own grandparents on my mother's side. My grandfather was Belgian and my grandmother was Polish, and they, came over as immigrants shortly after the turn of the, he came over as an immigrant. She was born here shortly after the turn of the 20th century, in Toledo, Ohio. And he worked at Libby Owens Ford glass, factory. And, they were able to buy a single family home, pay it off probably in less than 5 years. They could walk to church. They could walk to the dance hall. They would take vacations in the summer, hop on a train or load up the car and go to, a lake somewhere in Michigan, and they would waltz all weekend. And it's just unbelievable. That would be impossible to do today. And it's a tragedy that the greatest middle class that the world has ever seen has been gutted.
Yes, it decimated, and all the way across the country. I believe I'm accurate when I say in their book, they said that 2000 was the first time in American history when children would not expect to be richer than and live longer than their parents. First time in American history. It's sort of shocking. So you say to yourself, what happened in the 90s and in the 2000s to change that? And you come back, in my judgment, there's a variety of things we can talk about, all of them. But to me, the biggest single one was NAFTA, the Uruguay round, or the creation of WTO, letting China, giving China most favored nation treatment, all of which were done in a very short period of time. There was this kind of notion that we'd won the Cold War, and it was inherited by people in the Clinton administration who were, I don't mean this to be partisan, but who were, because it was Republicans who thought the same way, that they thought, this was like the end of history and we're now on a new glide path. And they wanted this uber free trade. And the result was some people got very wealthy, but the vast majority of people got some cheap stuff, but basically lost their jobs and lost their communities and ultimately their families, and in a lot of cases their lives. So it was a turning point right during that period that, in my judgment, was very serious, and it explains. So before that, I mentioned 1970 as being sort of the beginning of towns like. That sort of the top for towns like Ashtabula and others, because we saw the assault of Japanese manufacturing and the like, and this manufactured comparative advantage, not real comparative advantage, but industrial policy and the effect it was having. And then a lot of Reagan Democrats were people who saw that coming, people in the auto industry and others who saw, holy cow, I'm going to break with the what's the kind of mainstream policy to go with Ronald Reagan, and it did make a difference during his administration. But then they kind of won the Cold War. We get into the 90s, and there's this doubling down on this policy, and then we saw what basically has been the result.
Yeah,
and a lot of that is what created made the ground fertile for the Trump revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to come back to the Trump revolution, and then also kind of forward looking what we could hope to achieve through economic policy. But getting back to your own story, and a lot of our key audience is students for this podcast. And one lesson I've learned in my own life, but also in reading books and studying other people, is the importance of mentors that come alongside you along the way, and also of relationships. And really, you can kind of trace someone's career by the relationships that they make. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your relationship with Bob Dole when you were younger, and also Ronald Reagan.
So let me say first of all, on your basic point about mentors, that there is essential. The number of people who really kind of made it on their own is a very small number, and usually that number lives in some delusion because they really didn't do it after all. And when talking to young people, and I'm as you know, I'm very supportive of ISI and the work you do. And
thank you.
If we're losing the cultural war, it would have been a heck of a lot worse if it wasn't for you guys and what you do. But it's important for people to think about kind of minor mentors, first of all, before you talk about these big people. You have a teacher here, you have a friend's parent there. There's a lot of little things that add up. I can remember, teachers who didn't change your life in the sense that they, redirected it, but gave you confidence or made you kind of realize something that kind of got you to the next level. So I think people have to think about that too. But in terms of major influences on my life, and there were some others too. There were some lawyers that I worked with because I got out of law school, went to a law firm for a few years. And there were people there that you learned something from, right? Every successful person you can learn something from, I guess, is the point I want to make. And it's important to learn those things and to kind of tell yourself that you are learning them. It's not just a look back thing. It's an actual taking advantage of opportunities and figuring stuff out, even if it's not going to be wholly life changing. But so I didn't really know Senator Dole. We talk about Bob Dole. I never called him Bob Dole his whole life, right? Literally never. And I started, I got to know him in 1977. So I knew him a long time, but I never called him anything other than Senator. But he was looking for a young conservative lawyer to kind of, be his key guy after the 1976 campaign where he ran for vice president with Gerald Ford. And I got to know him a little bit then, and then he was becoming Republican ranking member, so not chairman yet. And I worked for him as the chief of staff for the Republican staff for 2 years. And then Reagan won. We got a bunch of seats. We became the majority, and then I was the staff director of the whole committee. He was an interesting guy. He was like the Bob Dole that I worked for, and I think he's enormously important in American history. But the Bob Dole I worked for was like a different guy than the one I knew at the end, right?
Okay.
He kind of went through, and he was out for 25 years or something by the time of his death from government work. But he was always busy and always going to the conventions, working on important policy stuff as a former senator rather than senator. When I knew him, he was a smart, tough, very hardworking guy. When I say tough, I mean I had a great relationship with him and loved him, and we stayed close forever. And I learned an enormous amount from him. Some completely mundane things that I passed on to my staff, and probably more than anything, you're kind of inspired because he had a story that you talk about my story or your story or the story of other people that are in this series. I mean, none of them quite compare to Bob Dole's theory, right? I mean, it's this young kid from Kansas. He's going to college. He's going to be a medical doctor. He goes off to the war. He gets blown up in Italy. He comes back. He can't use his arms and legs. He's 40 months in the hospital, scores of operations. and then works his way back up and becomes a presidential candidate. And in many ways is one of the lions of our party for 30 years. 40 years. So it's a real great story. I mean, and living in the Depression in the basement of his own house with his family so they could rent the upstairs so they could live. And he had a picture of his father in bib overalls. His father was they were very poor people. They probably, was, and then the operations are paid for by the drugstore where he worked as a clerk, passing out money in a cigar box. I mean, it's like this great American story on 1,000 different levels. And then he goes on to be this strong, obviously very smart, but strong conservative. Mm-hmm. And it was a blessing, right, to have that opportunity to sort of be with him and to kind of go through a certain part of his stuff. And it was an important part because first of all, we did the second of the last Great Trade Act, which was called the Tokyo Round. But we also did all the Reagan stuff. We did all the Reagan economic plan in 81. We did, in 82, we did a lot of spending cuts and the like, which probably hasn't been done since. And then in 83, we did the last time Social Security was reformed, right? He and Senator Moynihan, who is one of my all-time favorites, and I learned an enormous amount from Senator Moynihan. I went to China with Senator Moynihan. It was interesting. He was a smart guy, and but Senator Moynihan was one of these guys who you'd bring up a subject. You say, "Oh yeah, you should read my book on that." So in other words, it's like, oh, I guess yeah. But anyhow, Moynihan and Dole got together at Social Security. So those were like monumental things, and it was done at a time when Reagan had come in. There was an enormous amount of hostility in the media and the elites against Reagan, much as there was against Trump. We had Democrats controlling the House for all that period. The Republicans had not controlled the Senate for, I believe, 24 years when it happened. There had been other than Tom Thurman, there was no Republican senator who had ever been in the majority. And in the case of Thurman, he was in the majority as a Democrat, right? So it was a very pivotal time in American history. An enormous amount got done. And in those days, just incidentally, because I think back about it, the Senate operated completely differently than they do now. It was like the Senate had always operated. Members would offer amendments, and they would have a process. Yeah. It was none of this kind of write it in a staff back room with a leader and then say, "Here, vote yes or no." Right? Yeah. It was a process where, like when we did the tax bill, we would be on the floor for 3 weeks. Till 10 o'clock at night. Really? Every day. And you'd have hundreds of amendments, literally, just one after the other. And you would have to go through and fight these amendments, and the leaders would have to argue, and then you would write a little thing, and the members would come in and vote, and there would be scores and scores of votes on every aspect of the bill. And it was a great process because members would then get a stake in it, right? And they would start coming, so it was why did that? Yeah. Why does that not happen? So, I mean, it's a subject of your next book. But I would just to summarize it as quickly as possible. So part of what happened was we had the filibuster, but people would only use it on serious things. Okay. But if you did a filibuster, you had to stand there and talk. Mm-hmm. Then they decided, well, that was kind of counterproductive. Let's have like a quiet. So you'll say, I object. I'm going to filibuster that. They'll say, okay, we'll go on to other business. And when you did that, people started saying they're going to filibuster all kinds of crazy things. So that's why you'll have like an assistant secretary of Commerce nominee who no one knows anything about, and someone will say, well, I object, and I'm going to filibuster. Well, if you told the guy, okay, fine, we're going to bring this up tomorrow at 9 o'clock, and you're going to talk. When you're done talking, we're going to vote. You think the guy's going to talk for 2 weeks? Yeah. No. So part of it was a change in the process of not making people actually stand up for what they claimed. So that was part of it. But the other part of it was easy for leadership to come together and then try to put together packages. And as opposed to the chairman of the committee working out a package in his committee with hundreds of votes,
Yeah.
or at least scores of votes on all these, and committee members making amendments, and then bringing that package to the floor. And there was less control by leaders, obviously. There was less control by the White House, but it was a better process.
Okay. And then also, something that I picked up throughout your book was you had relationships, and you do to this day, kind of with people across the political spectrum in DC that have, 30, 40 years or more. It's hard to think of, you talk about Senator Dole and Moynihan working together. It's harder to imagine that kind of working across party lines. And I think it was probably helped by the fact that these people knew each other. They were friends for so many years. What do those friendships look like? Or is friendship, I don't know, is it possible in DC, or how do you think about that?
So, first of all, I have to be careful when I get questions like this. I'll start going down rabbit holes.
Okay.
If you say, were these people all friends in the way you have friends?
Sure.
I would say mostly not.
Okay.
But it was more they worked together.
Yeah.
So, there were some people who, when I name names, I won't, but who were close personal friends. But for the most part, they worked together, had a level of respect. There were some differences. Remember, one difference was that we had in those days Southern Democrats.
Okay.
And so Southern Democrats would kind of help the Democratic caucus from becoming too extreme, right? Because they needed those people for the majority. Those people thought more or less like you and I thought, and not on everything, but on some things. And so it kind of helped them a little bit. We also, on the other side, had a few, not a lot, but a few Northeastern Republicans in the Senate, for example. We had Cohen, we had several that were, and they would have the same effect on the Republican Party. Okay. So through the process, the Republicans basically reclaimed the Democrats from the South who didn't really represent their districts because they were more liberal than their districts, and those became and the Democrats did the same thing in the Northeast.
Okay.
There are some very good people. Susan Collins comes to mind, but there are others. But it used to be a lot more.
Sure.
So to some extent, the electoral process has kind of separated this out a little bit. I always resisted this notion that I've had at various times during my career, which has gone on, as you say, for a long time. Some would say too long, probably. But this notion that, things were really great in the old days and they're terrible now. I mean, I've heard that. I told you how many times I've heard it during my career.
Sure.
And my position was always, things were never as good at the good old days as anybody remembers. They just weren't. I was there and they weren't. And there was a toxicity. But I finally come to the conclusion now with the current phenomenon that it actually has fundamentally changed. Mm-hmm. I didn't believe that in past times. And if you look back in American history, you can see lots of times when there was enormous amount of toxicity, including when I went to college in the 60s. But you can go back into the 19th century and all of this, where there were lots of bad times. But it is really, really bad now, and it's different than it has been. So can people work across the aisle? I think we proved we can. I mean, we give no credit to President Trump for doing it, but the fact is that the biggest trade bill that was passed in our history, arguably, was USMCA, and it got 90% of Republicans, 90% of Democrats to vote for it.
Yeah.
And it was a process, and it took time, and it was done like the old way. We went through the process, and everybody had their chance, and we kept people involved all the way through the process. And I worked during that with an enormous amount of Democrats, and they worked in good faith, and they had the same objective that I did, that is to help working people, right? And we did it. So I think we proved you can do it, but it is very, very difficult.
So I want to transition to kind of leadership lessons at a higher level, both from some of our previous conversations, but also I want to start as a segue with another one of Senator Dole's kind of lessons, which you cite that if you want me on the plane when it lands, you better be on it. I better be on it when it takes off.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that was a big part of your work, actually getting the trade deal across the aisle was, you took that approach when dealing with members of Congress. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Well, I mean, it's funny. It's funny when you talk about the various lessons from Senator Dole, and you know, I wouldn't say that he taught me more than President Trump, or that he influenced me more than Ronald Reagan, but in the sense that he was there first, right?
Yeah.
When I was youngest, it had to have the most profound effect, right?
Sure.
It just had to have. But and I'll tell you one of the things, and this is like another rabbit hole, but one of the things I did learn from him, and I talked to my staff, don't make decisions until you have to, just as a practical matter. Don't make decisions when you have to make them. And if you do, you will find that lots of decisions are made by themselves. And this was clear. It wasn't something that Senator Dole ever articulated, but it was something with him day and night. I just said, this is clearly how he operates. Yeah. And I incorporated it, and I told my staff at various times, I would say, just have this. Obviously, if you have to make a decision, you make the decision. If you don't have to make it, let them go away. You don't have to make them at all. And that keeps you from making mistakes. So that was one thing. Secondly, he was, so on this, if you want me on the plane when it lands, you got to put me. He did say that. I thought it was great wisdom. You want to put me on that plane to be, when it takes off. Otherwise, I'm not going to be there when it lands. And, part of that is reaching across the aisle when you organize. Part of it also is regular process, right? Yeah. Regular order, we would call it in the Senate, where you have opportunities in committee to do things, and you get buy-in, and you don't like the bill that much, but you have this amendment that's important to your people, and therefore you support the bill. There's a kind of a notion of that. So it is kind of a process thing. If you operate in the process, if you respect people on the other side, and Senator Dole had a lot of friends on the other side, but he was a tough partisan guy. Remember, he was head of the RNC, Republican National Committee, and he also is the one who, I believe, is the one who came up with, when Nixon, the committee to reelect the president, he's the one who came up with creep for the committee to reelect the president. Although he really did I want to make it clear, he did like Nixon a lot. He was a big Nixon. He was like a huge Eisenhower fan, as you can imagine. Yeah. Kansas, World War II, right? Huge Eisenhower person. And really is probably more than anyone else responsible for us getting a monument to Eisenhower on the Mall, right? It's probably more Bob Dole than any other single person, although a lot of people had a big role in it. He liked Nixon. He thought Nixon was a good, tough conservative. He loved Ronald Reagan. He ran against Reagan. Remember, in '80, Dole was a candidate in '80. Remember, he had been vice presidential candidate in '76. So '80, he ran. Maybe the strongest field we've had until now in the Republican Party, because we had Bob Dole, we had Howard Baker, we had George Herbert Walker Bush, we had the governor here, DuPont, I believe, was in that race. So it was a very, very strong group of, just in my opinion, just giants, right, that were running. And I think if you look across, the optimistic view is, if you look across the Republican Party right now, you see, for the first time, that same kind of number of really, really strong people. Very encouraging.
Absolutely.
Aspect of it.
So one practical follow-up to that, the maxim of getting on the plane from the beginning. What if you know that the person is going to be hostile? What if you want them to be on it when it lands, but do you always put them on it from the beginning, or are there times when you got to get it off the ground and then they're stuck with it,
it's right? Like every great rule. It's defined by its exceptions.
Sure.
There were lots of times when I knew it. I'm not going to mention precise cases, but there are lots of times when someone is, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, and in the final analysis, they have to vote with you. Yeah. And I would have these conversations with my inner staff, and I would say, we're not making any more concessions. They have to be with us. They don't have any choice. Yeah. And you can analyze those times. Sometimes you're wrong, but very rarely are you wrong. You can say, they can say whatever they want. In the final analysis, they will not vote on the other side. That happens a lot.
Yeah.
So there are exceptions to the rule.
Sure.
But the notion of the way to operate is that way. Let's get everyone together. Let's try to get, you're not going to get everyone, let's be honest, but let's get a substantial majority on board. Let's have it be bipartisan if possible. If not, then you do what you have to do. But that notion is a positive one. But your point's a good one. There are lots of times when I sat down and said, they don't have any choice. Because if they vote against us, they're basically defeating themselves. And they're not going to do that. It's not in their interest. So you make a good point. All these rules are perfect until you find an exception.
Sure. So a few other things that we have chatted about before, lessons from your own life. One was to stay in your lane. 2 was don't take the credit, and 3 was pick your battles.
Those were my kind of rules. I had a chapter in the book that the editor said, let's take that out because this is a policy book and people don't want too much biography. They don't want too much history. I don't necessarily agree with that, but on the other hand, this guy had done a lot of books, and I had only done this one. But those are the 3 things, and a fourth one, if you're going to have one, would be stay out of the press to the extent you're possible. Stay out of the press. Now, a lot of people can't get that one, but for sure, and I say that, take out of the press, because no elected official really wants to see his staff standing in front of him. It's just human nature, and you're better off. All you can do is kind of create problems for yourself. But for sure. If you fight every battle every day, you will lose every battle every day. And if you fight one battle every day, you will win some battles. So for sure, that's true. Staying in your lane is absolutely true. I talk about it, and indeed, Jared has in his book. Jared Kushner's a dear friend. He has in his book the time when I was in his office and we're doing some stuff on trade, and he asked me about, he's talking to a senator about immigration, and he asked me about immigration, and I said, I've got this job that's so important to the president, and I have one chance in 1,000 of getting it actually done right. And if I start getting into every one of these other hot button issues, it's going to be 1 in a million. I'm not going to do that. And he cites that in his book as sort of evidence of a way to kind of get things done. You stay in your own lane for sure. And you pick your fights. And in terms of taking credit, I mean, that was one of Reagan's great comments, that it's amazing how much you can get done if you don't care who gets credit for it. I always had that view. And by the way, I tell the young people watching, you always get enough damn credit anyway, right? You trust me, it'll work out, right? If you really accomplish stuff, you get enough credit from the people who understand. But for sure, most people go to Washington, they're worried about fighting too many battles. They're worried about getting involved in every damn thing, and they're worried about getting credit. And if you basically resist those 3 temptations, I personally, at least as we're done in my case, I think you end up doing better.
So would you say that I think the answer is yes, but as a young person going to DC, I think there is this temptation to become a generalist, right? And to weigh in on X, right? In writing op-eds and literally every issue under the sun. And you're bound to, make a lot of enemies like that. So would you advise kind of become a master in a particular niche area, and then it's through that niche that eventually you might get to say more about other things, or how?
So yeah, I think that's wisdom. Now remember, when you say come to Washington, some people are coming to do politics. Right. They're doing politics. They're doing the technology of people getting elected. And I was involved in that, in the Dole years. I was involved in that technology because I was a vice chairman of one of his. Remember, he ran in 80, 88, and 96. I was treasurer in 1 year. I was vice chairman in another. But I was involved in organizing people and do it every year. So I was involved in that technology or something. So those people are not going to get real expertise in anything. But I think as a general matter, you're better off focusing in an area, developing real expertise, so that when you're in the room, you know more about what is being talked about than anyone else in the room. And the other thing, two other points to that, you know more, you know more, and the other people know you know more. So if you get to that stage, then you can kind of move things in a different direction, right? That was always my idea. Now there are lots of people that had wonderful careers who did a lot of different things, but I think if it's really important, it's important to know it from inside out and to have kind of gone through it all.
So now moving to American history, some people would say, oh, this economic patriotism of President Trump and Ambassador Lighthizer, this is a departure from kind of the great American tradition of free trade. But obviously, we know that's not true, right? You can go all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay and Lincoln to see this American system tradition, and even this was really the tradition of the Republican Party for decades, from the time of the Civil War up until World War One. So I'm curious about the intellectual roots and kind of the economic, statesmen that you admire and look up to.
Let me say, first of all, not only didn't the United States develop that way, no other country on earth did. Right? So it's basically it's this absolute unicorn that everyone claims is in their own pasture, right? So it makes no sense. So if you go back, I think you hit on him. If you say, who's the father of American conservatives, is Alexander Hamilton, right? Almost for sure. And he completely believed in using an economic policy. Now, you have to be careful. I always tell people that every subsidy is not good. The assumption should be the subsidies are bad. Tariffs, you have to make sure they make sense. And the rest of the industrial policy, which is banking system, labor system, and by all these things are part of what is really an industrial policy. But the people I admire, if you look at every president from obviously our first Republican president was Abraham Lincoln. But if you look at every one of those going forward until Eisenhower, every one of them would have said, no, either I'm a protectionist or I want tariffs or something. So then you move forward from Eisenhower. Eisenhower was otherwise focused, right? He had this Cold War that he was worrying about and the like. And even in the case of Eisenhower, he was still a nationalist, right? In many ways, economic nationalist. You move forward, you see what Nixon did in 1971. Nixon was very worried about trade deficits, about the drain of gold from the United States. Ronald Reagan was, people say, well, Ronald Reagan talks as a free trader. One of these libertarian groups, when Reagan left office, said he was the most protectionist president since Hoover. Literally, that was the quote. Now, of course, they wouldn't say that now.
Sure.
But he put, voluntary restraint agreements or quotas on steel, automobiles. He helped, motorcycles, semiconductors. He had a policy. As I say, the default should be don't interfere, but you have to be willing to interfere when it's necessary, and particularly when other people interfere. So obviously, I thought that Ronald Reagan was one of my heroes in this area, and I worked with him and supported him in that area and did some of these negotiations that led to these VRAs. And then obviously Donald Trump, who just intuits where we are on these issues. And if you say what's at the core of President Trump, more than any other issue, it is trade. If you see the man in his 30s is this rich developer, and he's talking all the time about how workmen are getting screwed, right? It literally was just like so much a part of his whole being. And I say in the book that in I think it was 87, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all these places, bemoaning what was going on, and he was focusing very much on this issue. And he comes at it from the point of view is we're interested in what happens to working people. That's what the definition is. The definition, what's important is not just the price of everything, price optimization. What is really important is the effect it has on workers and families and communities that make the country great. And that was obviously very much our focus. But manufacturing, the importance of manufacturing, the importance of industry developing in the United States, of contributing to America's strength. If you look at that I would say conservative theme that runs through from Hamilton all the way through, you can see that really is the core of what our economic policy was. And then we decided for a period of time that, well, we have to make certain concessions. We were the only country in the world with an economy after World War II, and so you want to make concessions, and that was probably smart. But even if you look at that for years and years and years, the trade deficits were small. They weren't, I mean, they weren't horrific. But then, we get into the 90s and the 2000s, and all of a sudden we're recently in the Biden administration running $1 trillion trade deficits. It's a transfer of wealth that makes our country poorer, just period. And it also adversely affects our workers. And it leads to this income inequality, which dissolves the kind of fabric of our country, right? When you have, instead of a country where everyone is middle class, with some exceptions on both ends, it becomes a country where you have rich people and a bunch of people that are trying to get into the middle class. And that's not the country that, that we want, certainly that I was raised in.
And I think that fundamentally erodes the American Republic. And I think even historically, any great statesman, if you have, massive income inequality and the middle is hollowed out, right? That's sort of the warning light should be going off that structurally something's wrong, right?
And we have that. And there are lots of data points on it that prove it. For the first time in our history, the middle 60% has less wealth than the top 1%. I mean, that's not America. And I'll tell you another one that's not in the book that I looked at. I got this data. I picked these dates, not for any political reason, but just because that's when I have the data. If you think of 3 dates, if you think of 1963, 83, and 2016, so those are your 3 dates, all right? And you're looking at 3 people. The person who's right at the 1%, the top, the person at the 90th percentile or top 10%, and the woman or guy in the middle. Those are your 3. From 63 to 83, the guy at the top doubled his wealth. The guy at the 10th percentile doubled his wealth. And the guy in the middle doubled his wealth. Now, that's like, okay. Now, of course, people move from one to the other, but that's like a system that makes some sense. You take the next period. Now, it's a longer period. But the guy at the top, the 1%, he triples his wealth. The guy at the 90th percent, he doubles. And the guy right smack in the middle, he increases over that 30-some year period by 18%. Nominally. So he's really worth less than he was when he started. And, now, as I say, you can, I picked those data points because that's what I have. You can aspire, you can read into it whatever politics you want, but the reality is that's a bad trend.
Yeah, definitely. So in 1997, right, you had the foresight to write an op-ed in the New York Times warning about the potential entry of China into the World Trade Organization. This was something that very few people saw at the time. What were you seeing, and what did they want? What was their ambition at that point?
So I have been skeptical of the whole, process and trade deficits and the like from the beginning. It didn't start at that time, but it was clear to me that I would say 2 things. First of all, at least I had a couple of op-eds, one of which said about Clinton, that there was this big scandal about Indonesian money going into the Clinton campaign in 96. And what I wrote in this article was that was not really Indonesian money. It was called Chinese, right? So the Indonesian, they were all Chinese.
This was the what do Chinese terrorists want?
So that exactly. So it was China that was doing it, and they were transferring lots of money into Clinton. And my own view is, it's just a guess, I can't prove it, that they put lots into the foundation too. But so what do they want for this investment in Clinton? Remember, Clinton had first run for election as a kind of a hawk on China, and then very much changed over the course of his first term. So that was the conclusion. Like, what do they want? And what they want is most favored nation treatment. They want to get U.S. tariffs down. Up till then, every year you could have a vote to take away favored tariffs from China. It wasn't focused just on China, but China was in the category that happened to. And what they wanted to do was get rid of that, get into the WTO. And then I said, if that happens, no American job is going to be safe. And it turned out that was completely true. I wrote some other pieces also about it. It was clear that China's objective was pure and simple mercantilism, right? They were taking assets away from their own resources, away from their own consumers, giving it to their manufacturers. They were doing everything they could. They designed a whole system. It wasn't just tariffs and subsidies. It was a whole system designed to help manufacturing. And then basically, instead of exporting to import to help the people, they were exporting to get rich, to get more money, to get wealthier, and to buy foreign assets. And it was clear to me that they were going to do it. It had nothing in the world to do with comparative advantage in the way economists all talked about it. It was a manufactured advantage that had nothing to do with free trade or market economics or anything. They were a totalitarian state that was trying to do this. And now I think anyone who looks at it in the last 10 years and denies it just, probably has some influence they're probably influenced by the Chinese, because it's so obvious that it's true now.
So then fast forwarding to 2016. So there's this period of almost 20 years between you writing those op-eds and then kind of the waves of fortune aligning with the issue that you've been talking about for decades. So Trump gets elected. Really, I think you could say that the single greatest kind of accomplishment of the Trump presidency was changing America's view on China. This is something that even if in DC, even in 2018, if you were to talk about what China's doing in DC, people would look at you. You couldn't really say a lot of this at many of the mainstream think tanks, but now I think it's conventional wisdom, China's predatory nature. Talk about your time in the Trump administration. You talk about balance a lot. You also talk about leverage. So what was your end game with China?
Well, I mean, like all of these things, I was always skeptical, right? And I knew that what their objectives were. And I think we have to remind ourselves that they are communist, Marxist, totalitarian, right? I mean, and really are an adversary. And you have to, any China analysis has to start with that. If you think they're Switzerland, then you have one prescription. If you think they're somebody that has that is an adversary, then you have another prescription. And so convincing people, I would always do sort of when I would have talks, I would always do sort of, let's go down the list, look at the military and how they're fortifying the South China Sea and how they're intimidating U.S. ships in open water and U.S. airplanes, and they're stealing our technology, and they're suborning espionage in our military, our Navy. They're hostile towards Japan, where they've had ships go around, obviously, towards Taiwan, towards the Philippines, towards India, towards Vietnam. You can kind of go around. You can sort of see this pattern. The fentanyl thing that we talked about, you can just sort of go down and say they're wolf warrior diplomats who are out there, criticizing the United States. So you can see what their objective is. And then at that point, the question is, what should the policy prescription be? And there's kind of a migration. To me, it is strategic decoupling. And I define strategic decoupling as one, I'm not saying no economic relationship, because that's unrealistic. We ought to be able to sell to them. We have agriculture sales. We have a variety of other things that are important to them. We sell whatever, $150 billion worth of stuff to them. And we ought to continue to do that. But we shouldn't buy more from them than we sell to them, because we want to stop this wealth transfer. These trade deficits are a wealth transfer to China from the United States. So we want to stop that. I think we have to develop our technology independently. They clearly weaponize technology, and they steal technology, and they force technology transfer. So we have to get our technology to be more independent. I think we have to be very careful monitoring incoming investment.
Mm-hmm.
Every dollar of investment that China, of any consequence, that China puts into the United States, it's done because the Chinese Communist Party has decided this is in the interest of China or the party, but not in our interest. And then I think the same thing should be true on outgoing investment. The notion that because a New York banker gets rich, we should invest in technology that's actually helping the Chinese military is so beyond preposterous. So those are kinds of the elements of what I call strategic decoupling. And if you say to yourself, well, some people say, well, gosh, that's pretty radical. And my response is, first of all, you don't understand that adversary relations. Well, I've missed part one. Let's go back to the indictment.
Yeah.
But secondly, if you look at it the other way, this is precisely what the Chinese policy is towards us. Their policy is to take advantage of the trade, to develop independent technology, and to control investment going each way for their interests. So it is strategic decoupling with Chinese characteristics, we could say, right?
Yeah, because if we don't have a strategy, we're playing by their strategy.
Yeah, exactly. And this is precisely their strategy. And it's not just the United States, although we're the focus. It really is the West. It's the democracies. I was reading recently we talk about the Belt and Road and how they're trying to use that and what a debt trap that is and all this. But one of the other parts of it that I was just reading in the last day or so is they're trying to get these third world countries to become more authoritarian. I mean, it's sort of anti-democratic as well as economic. They literally say, that their leaders believe that authoritarianism is an important part of this process, and they want them to be more authoritarian. So it's a bad process. It starts with understanding the nature of the problem, and then you get to the point where the economics are designed to help us.
Yeah. Okay. So take me to the first time you go to China with President Trump. This is in 2017?
November of
2017. Yeah. And you describe kind of this Chinese charm offensive. There's, a row of, Chinese soldiers. There's the tour of the Forgotten City. You're in the Great Hall of the People. So, to what extent, I guess before we get into kind of what happened, to what extent do you think the aesthetics, of these negotiations matter or sway people or make an impact? Or throughout that charm offensive, are you just thinking to yourself, whatever, this is just they're putting on a show, but it doesn't really change anything?
So first of all, the charm offensive even started before I got into office, right? Because they went to Mar-a-Lago while I was still in the confirmation process. And so, they put on a grand show, but strategically, that's no different than every other country, right? They have more resources. They can do a grand job, but everybody sort of does it, including us, right? We do the same bloody thing. We have our soldiers in our bands, all that sort of thing. But how much it influences people certainly doesn't influence me.
Sure.
I sort of find it interesting. But and it was quite a show. I mean, the formal review, the tour of the Forbidden City, the state dinner with the entertainment, it was all really extraordinary. And they, did it have an impact? I don't know. It's hard to be honest. It's President Trump sort of has his ideas, and this is what he's going to do. And he's perfectly fine saying, listen, we'll be friends. That's good. We'll be friends, but I'm still going to do what's in my interest. And if it hurts you, then too bad. Yeah. But I'm taking care of my workers, and you take care of yours. And he makes that all the time. But they're taking care of their people. That's their job. I take care of my people. That's my job. And I'm using my leverage and the like. But in the meeting, we had a couple of meetings, but the big meeting was basically 11 or 12 on each side. In this great hall that's big enough to play football in. I mean, it's a big hall. We're in the middle, and the staff is out of the room. So there's just the 11 or 12 on each side. And, the President Xi reads his statement. President Trump reads his statement. The foreign minister, Secretary of State. And then President Trump says, well, Bob, tell him our view on trade.
Were you expecting? Would you have?
Well, in the first place, one thing you learn early on, and this was early on for me, right? This was November. It was pretty early in the first year. Is you better know what you want to say if you're called on.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're sitting there, particularly with trade, because remember, it's on the top of President Trump's brain, right? He's thinking about it since he was, 30, 35. So he's thinking about it. And he's going to say, he makes his points. He knows what he's talking about.
Yeah.
This is the core. He knows what's going on. And then he's going to say, Bob, give him the details or however he introduces it. So, did I have something prepared, written out? No, I had nothing. I had in my mind what I would say if called upon. And so he did call me next. And I'm like the first person who's not reading anything.
Yeah.
And I spoke for several minutes very respectfully, because my objective was not to insult anybody. I just wanted you to understand this is how we see it from our point of view, what this relationship is and how bad it is for our people.
Yeah.
That's basically what I said, and how good it is and we're really the victim here. We are the victim of this process. You're not the victim, we're the victim. And it was, I talk about it in the book. People were like, God, somebody spoke the truth. That's not supposed to happen. What's going on here, right? Doesn't he know anything about protocol? Nobody says the truth in these situations. And then you could sort of see them; they're kind of half reacting, and then they went back to the reading the statements.
Stick to the script, yeah.
But it was interesting, and of course, some of our staff people were listening out the door, and they're like, "Holy cow! This is like the first time this has ever happened." And they kind of first got the notion that, oh God, he really is like we thought he was. He being me in this case. So, and I'll tell you something. President Trump supported me 100% of the time. And if you think of in the early years, every one of these free trade type Republicans, of which there were a lot and are still some, every one of them would be, no, he's wrong, he's this, I'm very specific, but whatever the lobbyists would go to I won't mention names, the lobbyist goes to a free trade Republican, he goes to the president, and some of the issues he knew, some of them were too technical, and we would talk about, but 100% of the time he was like, if this is the right thing for the people that we're working on, that's what we're going with, right? It was never, this company, it was never either that. It was like, I used to tell people, if you want to lose an argument in front of President Trump and you're arguing two aides, start talking about how it's going to help this big company or that big company instead of how it's going to help these workers or these people, right? I mean, that immediately you can sort of see them like, what are we doing here? Yeah, these are my people.
And what about the situations where obviously Trump backed you 100% and he's had these views on trade forever, but that wasn't, to your point, not all Republicans shared that view. Many were free traders. Even some in the administration were free traders. So was that something that the Chinese were trying to exploit, or
what do you think?
Yes, obviously. and then how does it work when you're advocating for American interests, but your own side has some divisions?
Well, let me say, first of all, the Trump administration was no different than every other administration since Washington. Right? Because we had Washington and we had Alexander Hamilton and Jefferson in the first cabinet, and they didn't agree on these very fundamental things. So our administration was no different. You had people who one side, people on the other side, and everybody, of course, tries to exploit that, and they have literally since Washington. Right? They've always tried to exploit that, depending on which side you're on. And we had it in our administration. One of the advantages we had is that there was a general view that none of us were elected, right? Which is kind of an important part. If you're basically, the cabinet is staff. You're not an elected official. It was Trump and Pence. They were elected. The rest of us were all just staff people. And people operating on their own based on what they think should be done without the authority of the president, that just isn't something that happens, right? In this administration, it happens in a lot of other administrations. It's happening, I believe, in the current one.
Sure.
But we realized we were not elected, and the boss was going to make these decisions, at least directionally, not every single one. And he made it very clear that with respect to the China negotiations, I was in charge, right? He did that because he thought I most closely aligned with him. And my approach always was that on things that mattered, we should have a meeting with the people on both sides in front of him and make our arguments and let him make the decision. I mean, this is a bit of a rabbit hole too, but it was a wonderful way that he made decisions. There's this kind of sense that the mainstream media has that it was somehow chaos. The important decisions in my area, which were the most important area, and I presume in other areas, but I can't speak to it. In my area, the decisions were basically made with the president sitting behind the Resolute desk, 4 or 6 people in chairs facing him, further staff on the couches behind that you see in all the pictures. And we would have the staff secretary or the chief of staff say, here's what, Mr. President, we're meeting about this. And then if it was my area, I would say, here's the issue, blah, blah. And then people would argue about it. They'd go back and forth, and sometimes the arguments were heated. The president was never heated, but we would get heated with each other. And then at the end of the time, the president would get up and he'd say, you're saying this or you're saying that. And he'd go back and forth, and then he'd make a decision. Occasionally you'd get a call and he'd say, I want to do this, I want to do that. And you'd say, well, you got to hear the other side too. He was a very sensible decision-making process. And when you do it that way, as opposed to like me acting in my area without everyone, the other side's being involved, when you do it that way, people kind of know what's happening. Right. It builds.
It doesn't catch them off guard.
It builds kind of collegiality in a way. Maybe that's too strong a term, but that kind of notion of teamwork. Because everyone had their chance, and you walk out of the room, and if you didn't prevail with the boss because he just disagreed with you as a matter of what was going to happen, and the benefits to the working people, then you at least know I had my chance, and I'll get a chance the next time. And it was a very sensible way to do business. And I fear that it happens that way in some administration, it doesn't in others. Right? In some, it's all staff driven, and the staff does everything. But on matters of consequence, the president made the decision after hearing debate. Which is, to me,
probably the way it should be.
Exactly the way it should be done. When look, he's a business guy. That's how he operated, right? He wanted to know what was going on. He's dealing with it like a businessman.
So there's an ancient Chinese legalist named Han Fei, who I included in my book on statesmanship. And, some people say that he inspires Xi Jinping. So the quote is, "The important thing in persuasion is to learn how to play up the aspects that the person you are talking to is proud of and play down the aspects that he is ashamed of." So I'm curious, in these negotiations, obviously you were, speaking the truth to the Chinese in a very formal setting when you were in that one of those initial meetings. How does the kind of the honor and shame culture that they have, they're probably not used to someone telling them like it is. Did that, I don't know, hurt? Did they take you more seriously? Did that help negotiations, or was being honest kind of a challenge?
First of all, I read that, and I found several chapters interesting. I found that chapter particularly interesting, but it struck me. I mean, it was sort of stated in a kind of a profound way. But what it's really saying is that when you're trying to convince someone, you got to convince them it's in their interest to go along with you, and that it's going to have a negative effect on them if you don't, right? And I love the profound way it's stated, but it's kind of, if you're a negotiator, and most of us are in some way or another, right? I mean, we do it at home, we do it, right? It's kind of intuitive. I always had the view when I was talking to, and this is not just the Chinese, with anyone, that you wanted the person that you're negotiating with to understand that this was not just a concession. This was something that was probably in their interest too. I had a few novel ideas. I won't tell you who, but a few novel ideas that were in the USMCA, and I had one of the people I was negotiating with was criticizing me, and I said, I just want to give you a thought. I said, if you're very public in criticizing this novel idea, down the road you will not be able to take credit for it, because it's going to happen. It's right. It's the smart thing to do. It's going to change the way people think about trade, and you're going to want to say you did it.
Yeah.
So don't go on the record. You can see a kind of a pause.
Yeah.
Like, that's interesting. I guess, maybe we got to be careful.
Interesting.
But I thought it was sort of intuitive. I don't know. They clearly, the Chinese, to get back to the Chinese in your quote, the Chinese are very different. I had another chapter that was dropped out of the book, was one on like everything, 40 pages of everything the Lighthizer think you should know about Chinese history. And once again, the editor's like, that's too much history in here. And so parts of the economic stuff I put in, but the essence of it, I didn't. And there are certain traits. And at one point, I had a senior Chinese official say something like, well, you've really studied us and you have an understanding. And I said, I have studied you, that I know so much that I know I don't have a clue, right? In other words, your assumption is you're basically mirror imaging.
Yeah.
Right. We used to use that term with this when we negotiated with the Soviets back in the old days. We would say we assume the Soviet guys think in the way I'm thinking.
Sure.
Mirror imaging. Of course, it's not true. And then when you really study the Chinese, you realize you really don't know.
Yeah.
There are certain things that kind of go through their history. They think that authoritarian. They've always thought authoritarianism is important. They've always thought that they did the best when they had one strong man in charge. And if you look at their history, you can say why. So you can see how they concluded that. Yeah. They were always more interested in control than would normally be than a Westerner would think of it. And the reason for that is, I remember Senator Moynihan telling me we were in China, and what was I in China? It might have been 84, a long time ago. And him saying chaos is never more than an inch below the surface. So you need control. And if you look at their history, you can see it. They have there's this chaos. It'll come up. And if you don't have control, you don't have chaos. There's a kind of a sort of a brutality of enforcement that comes from focusing so much on control. Anyway, there's a bunch of these themes that kind of run through it. And as I say, I've studied it enough to know that I don't have a clue, right, exactly how they're thinking. But I found that chapter interesting. I did. I thought, sort of on reflection at the end, it was kind of self-evident, but it was still sort of fun to kind of read it and see what was going on, what he was thinking about way back when. Yeah,
for sure. So before we kind of do some forward-looking kind of economic policy discussion, I think it's important to remind the listeners that phase one of the China deal that got done during your time in the Trump administration, and that's an enduring policy. It wasn't the tariffs. It wasn't just a way to provoke China to no end. There was actually an end. So can you describe briefly what was in phase one of the China deal and why that matters right now?
So for sure. So I believe, I've stated here that I believe strategic decoupling should be our objective, and that's the long-term objective. And I think that should be true for the West, but the United States should do it for themselves. And I believe that what the Trump policy was, or evolved into, was the beginning of that. So what did we have in there? And then I'll tell you what I prioritized. So we had commitments for purchases. We had systemic changes, some, not as many as we wanted, but there were a bunch of them. But there were 40-some changes in agriculture where they had system that was designed to exclude, that was limited. There was specific provisions on stopping forced technology transfer. There was enforceability in that we had a mechanism that would allow for resolution of disputes. But interestingly, it wasn't like an arbitration. It was, if you're the aggrieved party, you work through the system to try to resolve the resolution. If you can't, then you take action unilaterally, because they and I didn't see any point in having an arbitrator. If it was three of them and one of us, then they're going to win. If it's, if it was the other way, we should win. We don't always, but for sure, if it's two of them and one of us, we've lost, right? And you're not going to go out and get third parties, right, Norwegians, to make the decision. Yeah. So we had to do it that way. And then if you overcompensated, the other side would do what they're going to do. I mean, it was like any other agreement. It was going to last while it was going to last. So we had enforceability, we had technology, we had systemic changes, we had purchases, but we had tariffs. And to me, the most important part of the Phase 1 agreement is that we had tariffs in place, massive tariffs in place, and those tariffs had an effect. Indeed, there's a study that the Chinese have done at a couple of universities that said, from their calculation, this so-called trade war that we had was 3 times more damaging to them than it was to us. And of course, that always made sense. The relationship that we were trying to correct was enormously more beneficial to them than to us. We were making them rich. We were transferring technology, all at the expense of our own technology and our own workers. So we began the process of strategic decoupling. And this was not like, here's our plan day one, but we had a direction day one, and this is what it kind of evolved into. But the most important part of that agreement wasn't that they buy this or that for these number of years. It was that we had in place these tariffs. And the Biden administration, to their credit, has kept most of them. Now, they've given exclusions and things that I wouldn't have done. They've done several things that I wouldn't have done, but they did keep the tariffs. So now you business, you talked about how people have changed their attitude towards China. Part of the economic changing of it were these tariffs, because what we did is we took away certainty. So now a business person that's going to go and invest $1 billion in China essentially is selling the United States. He might think he's going to sell it, but that's not going to happen long. He doesn't have the certainty he had because the tariffs changed the economics. So I think that the agreement was very, very effective. I think it's sort of an odd thing, Johnny. The Chinese did not keep the agreement, for sure. They kept parts of it, but overall did not keep it. But because that wasn't the essential thing, the essential thing was the tariffs, that it was a wildly successful policy. It was a wildly successful policy. And I would add this, by not keeping the agreement, they're violating a trade agreement, which gives you the authority to put additional tariffs on. So to me, it was one of the great things that in the history books, they will write about President Trump, that he did this. He changed the way we have an adversary who was preying on us, that had the advantage, and he took the heat to change it, and to change it for American national security, American technology, but most importantly for American workers. He did that. And like a lot of things, you look back and you say, oh, of course. But it didn't look that way then on the other side. It was every single person was on the other side, and he was out there saying no. And it worked.
Yeah, remarkable. Yeah. So as we look forward to the next 4 years and even beyond, the next 30 years, well, a couple things. Well, one, you are a capitalist. You're not a libertarian, but you are in favor of lower taxes, deregulation generally. So I think that's one thing that sometimes perhaps you're misunderstood. They say, oh, Lighthizer is a statist. No, you're squarely in this American tradition of tariffs, but free markets at home. And but the second thing is that you believe in a common good vision for economics. I think you said that before your test of whether a policy should pass or not is does it help your average middle class American family living in Ohio or living in Michigan or elsewhere in the center of this country. So with those two things in mind, what do you think are the kind of top 3 or 4 economic priorities for your common good agenda?
Well, so you mean in a second Trump administration?
Yes, absolutely.
First of all, I can't speak for the president, and nor will I. Whenever I spoke for him, it's because he told me to. I never took it upon myself. But I would say for sure you need lower taxes on business, right? I mean, I just break with people here in the country. We can't have people leaving America to set their business up overseas because of our tax policy.
Yeah.
And lower taxes means lower tax rates, but it also means, and I don't want to get overly technical, but there are a lot of ways in which the tax system works to hurt American workers and American business. And one of the principal ways is that certain taxes are border adjusted and certain taxes aren't.
Okay.
So we have a system where we have an income tax. You tax an American company, it ships its product to France. It then has to pay the French value-added tax. So now it's fully taxed in America and is paying it in the French market, is paying the French tax. The French company, he sells to the United States, he gets his value-added tax rebated at the border. So he sends back to the United States without a value-added tax and then doesn't have to pay our income tax.
Okay.
That is a stupid system. And by the way, the Republicans have argued about this and agree with me and have for decades. And in the original Republican bill that started out, you remember the Ryan and Kevin Brady and their Republican bill in the House, they corrected this partially or substantially corrected this, and it didn't get through to the final. So we have to have lower taxes.
And on that point, real quick, so if we lower taxes without cutting spending, will the deficit grow, or is it your belief that the lowering of the taxes will stimulate the economy enough, kind of in the Reagan tax cut way, to make up?
So am I a supply side or yes? So my answer is yes, but the but is we want to cut spending anyway.
Sure.
I mean, if you said what's the number one thing we should do, it's cut spending. We have inflation because spending is crazy. It's trillions of dollars more than what the baseline should be. Trillions of dollars. And I mean, I was always a spending cutter, always. As I said, we did it in '82. We did it in the Social Security bill. I've done it over and over again. And now, you've got a knife and a fat pig. It ought to be easy to carve this thing. We don't have to worry about. You used to talk about don't cut to the bone. You don't have to. You can cut for a year and not get close to the bone. So for sure, we need to cut spending. Do tax cuts, in my judgment, grow revenue and grow the economy? Do I believe in that dynamic supply? Absolutely. 100%. We need deregulation or deregulation, not right, but less regulation. And President Trump was a complete believer in that. And I think we ended up getting rid of 8 or 9 regulations for new one we put in. We need a sensible dynamic energy policy. I mean, everything is affected by that. Inflation, jobs, business, the poor woman driving her car across Kansas to go to work, right? I mean, everybody is affected. So that's for sure something we need. And in my judgment, we need tariffs. We need an across-the-board tariff. We need to get back to balanced trade. We have to stop transferring our wealth overseas. And I want to come back to that for a second because it's important for people to understand why trade deficits matter. But to this question, we need substantial tariffs on China because they are an adversary and are taking advantage of us. We have to get that back to balance. I'm not talking about punishing, but we have to get back to balance. We have to have tariffs across the board. And I think that tariffs are, in the context of the way we thought about these things in the 80s, are a supply side. They are a production increasing a tool. And if you increase production, you're going to end up having an anti-inflationary effect, not a pro-inflationary effect. So systemically, now you might have an effect on this or effect on that, but systemically, if you think about it, we put tariffs in place and did not have inflation. So the notion that tariffs are in and of themselves inflationary is just proven wrong. I know every economist, I did my calculation, my model, which never predicted anything accurately in its entire existence, has predicted this. Therefore, it has to be true. The other thing I always say, if tariffs and trade barriers increased inflation, why does China have no inflation? They have more tariffs.
Yeah.
I mean, not just China, but they have more trade barriers than anyone in the world. So why? It doesn't make any sense to me. And now, so that's the answer to your question. That is the package. It's spending cuts. It's the sensible tax policy. It's sensible regulatory policy. It's energy. It's the essential international economic policy, which gets us to balance. You put all that together, I mean, it's gonna be a greater generator of wealth for average Americans, even than what happened in the first Trump years, in my judgment. And in those years, we saw something we hadn't seen in forever, for decades. We saw the average person's family income going up, I think from 18 to 19, up 6.8%, the highest in American history. And you saw people $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 richer in real terms than they were. And it was a result of these kinds of policies. I think you're going to see even a greater growth in a second 4 years. And it's going to be based on those same bloody core ideas and not doing stupid stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, because there's a lot of crazy stuff that's out there that people talk about. But on the trade deficits, let me go back to that just for a second, because I think it's important. There's this notion, of course, that spending deficits don't matter either, which of course we know is intuitively stupid. And every Republican in all the years I was involved always talked about the problem of the twin deficits, spending, fiscal, and trade deficit. And then in sort of very recent years, a certain group has said, well, the second doesn't matter. So the trade deficit does matter. First of all, we've talked about the effect on our workers. We've talked about the effect on our technology. But what these trade deficits really are is a transfer of wealth overseas. And then the overseas forces, eventually those dollars come back, and they come back in the form of buying U.S. equities, U.S. debt, and U.S. real property. That's where dollars come back. They come back here. And so you look at this statistic called the net investment position of a country. And that's how much, in our case, all Americans own around the world versus how much foreigners own in the United States, all right? And that, for most of our history, you can imagine, we were rich and it was a very positive number. That number is just short of a negative $20 trillion. So that's a real consequence. And the foreign interests, and it's not just China, it's others, the foreign interests not only own that 19 point something trillion dollars, but they own the future revenue of all of that. And I did an article on this in The Economist a couple of years ago, really drafting on an article that Warren Buffett had done before, kind of making the same point. And in those days, 20 years ago, the negative number was like 2 trillion. Now it's 10 times that. So these deficits are having a devastating effect on our communities, on our families, but they're also making the United States poorer.
Yeah. So one last economic policy question for you before we wrap up. So AI, right? So AI, yesterday I was planning, a couple days ago actually, my grocery list for the week. And I just typed into ChatGPT, come up with a meal plan. These are the things I like, blah, blah, blah. Within 30 seconds, it had the whole meal plan for the week, right? And then I said, put a grocery list together for this meal plan. 10 seconds later, grocery list done. I could plan the entire week in less than 5 minutes, right? Order the groceries. You could imagine this happening in applications in many other areas of life. So in one sense, there's a way in which this could be a beneficial thing for kind of the common good. But then there's also other concerns that AI could, there's lots of other kind of potential dangers with AI that could hurt American workers. How do you think about a healthy framework to kind of maximize the efficiencies, but also, is there a way to mitigate some of those negative effects?
Well, first of all, this notion that you can somehow control it. I mean, I think you've got to monitor it. You have to, try to do the kinds of things you're talking about. But the notion that somehow one country can say, we're going to do this or that, or this notion that we're going to get an agreement. I saw recently in the papers that, we're all going to agree that we're not going to have AI involved with our weapons systems. And I'm thinking, well, no one's going to, and of course that's going to be, no one's going to keep that.
That's if the Chinese have AI.
It's completely nutty, right?
Yeah.
So you can think of it either way, that it's going to cost Americans jobs. My own view, and I hope it develops this way, obviously I'm an admirer of it, and I think it's important and it's progress, right? You can't be against progress. But one way I think about it is there are a lot of workers who can't do certain sophisticated jobs that with the assistance of AI will be able to. So in many ways, AI should be beneficial in that sense. To the extent some other country has an advantage in cheap labor, which to me is probably not a legitimate advantage, really, that can be compensated with AI. To the extent on a practical level, something like de minimis, where you're letting product come in because the paperwork is too complicated. You can eliminate that. I see a lot of beneficial uses for it. I mean, obviously you have to watch and see what direction it's going in, but it's part of progress. It's like electricity. You could have fought it, or you could have said, we're going to use it to help our people. Yeah. And, or the personal computer. I mean, there's just a lot of these things that you could sit there and worry about it, or sit there and try to figure, we have to have a way that it's going to help the same group. We're talking about the same people. Yeah. And if it helps them plan their meals, God bless them. If it doesn't, then hopefully it'll help them get jobs and bring jobs home to America, do the kinds of things that we ought to be doing to make them richer and have their lives, better.
Okay. So last question for you. So President Trump, what's what lesson, or what's one thing or several things that you learned from working with him as a leader that you didn't know going in?
First of all, one of the things I had in one of the chapters that was dropped off was like, who is President Trump most like of our previous presidents? Because there's this notion of kind of vilifying him. Everyone has. And by the way, I was in the Reagan administration. The same people had the same notion of vilifying Reagan. And I grew up during the Nixon administration, and the same people hated him too. And you can go back, right? But anyway, so on this question, it's funny, I kind of concluded it was Teddy Roosevelt, and I based it on just my study of Teddy Roosevelt. But there's this great scene that Henry Adams talks about. He went to a dinner at the White House, and it's a fabulous quote. I have it on my phone, but it's basically, I sat there. And the woman who's the prime minister's wife, who was being vetted, was there, and Roosevelt was doing all the talking, and everyone's listening, and the term he uses is like the most indiscreet man in the world of his station, or something like that. And he's saying this, and he's saying that, and he's saying how there's the war and is coming in Russia, and there's a war in South Africa, and it's all coming together. I could stop it all in 24 hours. And then he went on, he says, and talked about the reasons why he was too busy to do it. And I thought, you could update the things. That was exactly what the boss was. Yeah. Henry Adams said that Teddy Roosevelt was pure act. That was his term for him. He said he's just pure act. And Donald Trump is like pure act. He is engaged. He is moving forward. He's making progress on a variety of things. He has instincts that are incredibly good, just incredibly good instincts, to the point that if he instinctively reacted to something that I knew and didn't agree with him on, I'd go back and think, maybe I should look at the foundation of this and see if I'm wrong. So he's trying to improve things in his vision everywhere all the time at the same time. And it was exactly like
Like
a guy,
TR.
like exactly the same. I had this great, I just sort of tingling in the back of my head. I said, this could be him. So, you know, I mean, I learned an enormous amount. I mean, one thing you learn is he's always on. He is pure act.
Mm-hmm.
He's always on, and he's always trying to move the ball forward, right? Wherever he sees, he tries to move the ball forward. You're not having kind of downtime and, you know, blah, 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 blah. Let's, you know, it's like he's always trying to make progress as he sees it. And obviously, you can tell from the book, I say he's a great president. I'm an enormous admirer. So in any event, I, you know, and there was an element of that in Reagan, although generationally it was different. And there was an element in Bob Dole who was trying to move things forward. So I kind of had these same things, but more than anything else, I think it's this kind of pure act, this kind of just keep it moving that sort of impressed me.
We'll end on that note. Ambassador Lighthizer, thanks for coming on the show.
Johnny, it's a pleasure to be here, and keep up your good work. ISI is very important, so keep doing it.